Leaks. Huge leaks of highly embarrassing and politically damaging material. And it's all over the front pages of the nation's leading newspapers. They make the administration look both dishonest and incompetent. The president is livid, and the Justice Department works feverishly to get restraining orders against the newspapers and to indict and prosecute the leakers. But in the end, the United States Supreme Court upholds the right of the New York Times and the Washington Post to publish the Pentagon Papers. It's the summer of 1971, and another victory has been won in the name of freedom of the press. You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Hello, everyone. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about American history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane, episode 34. In which we look at the 1735 trial of Peter Zenger and the origins of freedom of the press in the United States. We are coming to you this week from the Daniel Ellsberg Studios, located on the campus of Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com, and on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. Our executive producer, who always speaks on the record, sometimes using her outdoor voice, is Lulu Spencer. So what's happening this week at In the Past Lane? Well, your historian at large is at the midpoint of a 2-week summer vacation. I just finished a terrific week with family in Texas, and now I'm off to spend a week with more family at a beach house in my hometown of Gloucester, Massachusetts. Or as we say up there, Gloucester. Yeah, we're going to Gloucester, where we're going to have some lobster and drink some beer, talk about the Pats and the Sox. I can't wait. But vacation or no vacation, I'm still dropping episodes of In the Past Lane. This week we take up the story of the Peter Zenger trial of 1735. Zenger published a newspaper in New York, and he was thrown in jail on a charge of seditious libel for printing pieces that criticized the colony's governor. And as you'll soon hear, the trial that followed played a major role in establishing the principle of freedom of the press. Before we dive into that segment, I have a favor to ask. If you enjoy In the Past Lane, I'd really appreciate it if you told a friend about it. Or better still, shared an episode by including a link to our website in a text or email, or sharing something on Facebook or Twitter. Friend-to-friend referrals are one of the top ways that podcasts build their listening community, so thank you. Okay, people, leave your worries on the curb and hop in. What do you say we head to the beach? Your journey in the Past Lane begins now. With the news media under siege these days, and with some people, including one particularly powerful and influential person, denouncing it as so-called fake news, this seems like a good time to explore the history of a free press. Let's begin by considering how many important moments in American history have derived from or somehow involved the freedom of the press. The abolitionist press and the eventual end of slavery. Muckrakers at the turn of the 20th century and the exposure of abuses by big business. The Pentagon Papers and the withdrawal of the U.S. military from Vietnam. The Watergate investigation and the resignation of President Richard Nixon. Now, these are just a few examples of the central role a free press has played in American history. And they raise a few compelling questions. How did this idea get enshrined in the First Amendment? And how did it come to be seen as a central principle of American democracy? Well, it's a long and fascinating story, but it began with the arrest and prosecution of a little-known New York newspaper publisher named Peter Zenger in 1735. But before we go into the details of this famous incident, let's first take a brief look at the history of freedom of the press before 1735. Well, England probably had the freest press in the world in the 16th and 17th centuries. But that's a relative measure. It's the freest press. but hardly a free press by our modern standards. For most of the 16th and 17th centuries, British law required strict licensing of printers as a way to control what they published in books and pamphlets and newspapers. Even more significant were strict laws making seditious libel a crime. Now, seditious libel was broadly defined as any statement that criticized government officials and undermined the authority and reputation of the government. Here's a good example of this thinking. In 1704, a famous British justice declared that seditious libel prosecutions were essential because, quote, "It is very necessary for all governments that the people should have a good opinion of it," unquote. The truthfulness or accuracy of a statement was no defense. In fact, the law considered truthful statements to be worse than lies, because they were true. Writers, printers, and editors who were found guilty of seditious libel, they faced a fine, imprisonment, or both. This understanding of sharply limited press freedoms became the norm in colonial America, where British law held sway. But as we'll soon see, things were just different in the colonies. So with this in mind, let's turn to the story of Peter Zenger. Who was this important but now largely forgotten figure in American history? Well, his full name was John Peter Zenger, and he was born in 1697 in Germany. In 1710, he emigrated to America with his parents. They settled in New York, where Zenger was soon apprenticed to become a printer. And he did. And by the early 1730s, he owned a small printing business that provided a very modest income. Then, in 1733, good fortune smiled upon him. Zenger was approached by several men who offered to pay him to publish a newspaper. They were the political enemies of a new colonial governor, and they wanted a newspaper that would publish their criticisms of him. Zenger agreed, and so was born the New York Weekly Journal. Well, it didn't take long for Zenger to become embroiled in the bitter political feud that was then brewing in New York. It all started back in 1732, when New York's new colonial governor arrived. William Cosby landed in New York in August of 1732. Now, I'll bet you didn't know that New York once had a governor named Bill Cosby. Yep. Anyway, who was this guy? Like many colonial governors, Cosby came from an aristocratic background. He was well-connected, ambitious, and thoroughly corrupt. And like many colonial governors, his goal was to use his office to get rich and to get out as soon as possible. And it didn't take long for Cosby to alienate the people of New York. For example, when the Colonial Assembly voted to give him a gift of 750 pounds, which was kind of a tradition, Cosby denounced it as inadequate, so they raised it to 1,000 pounds. Cosby also began to place his favorites in key political positions, including his son. Other jobs he simply sold to the highest bidder. Then controversy exploded over the matter of the governor's salary. Now, in those days, it was customary for an interim governor to hand over to the incoming governor a portion of the salary he'd earned while in office. And again, this was custom, not the law. But Cosby demanded the interim governor turn over the salary. Well, the interim governor was offended by this demand, and so he refused. Cosby was enraged over this defiance, and he began to pursue legal action. But he knew that no jury would rule in his favor. So he came up with a clever maneuver and had the case heard by the colony's 3 justices of the Supreme Court. That meant there'd be no jury. The case came before the court in April of 1733. The Chief Justice, a man named Lewis Morris, declared the court had no right to hear the case, and so he dismissed it. Governor Cosby was furious at this action, and he demanded that Morris explain himself. So Morris wrote a vigorous dissent, and then hired Peter Zenger to publish it and distribute it widely. In response, Cosby then fired Morris from his post as Chief Justice. Well, as you can imagine, Cosby's heavy-handed tactics stirred fierce political opposition. Leading this opposition were Lewis Morris, the guy he just fired, and 2 lawyers, one named James Alexander and the other William Smith. And together they created what they called a popular party to oppose Cosby and his minions. And in the elections that occurred that fall in 1733, Lewis Morris and a number of other anti-Cosbyites won seats in the New York Colonial Assembly. Opposition to Cosby continued to grow, but Cosby controlled the only newspaper in the colony, the New York Gazette, and it was full of pro-Cosby coverage. So here's where Zenger comes in. He was approached by Governor Cosby's political enemies to start publishing the New York Weekly Journal. Zenger's role was mainly as the printer. The primary writers and editors for the paper were James Alexander and William Smith. Thus was born America's first oppositional newspaper. The first issue came out on November 5th, 1733, and as you can guess, it was really critical of Governor Cosby. In this issue and the others that followed, Zenger, Alexander, and Smith, very likely anticipating a legal confrontation with the governor, frequently defended their right to criticize the government. Listen to what Alexander wrote in the second issue of the newspaper. The loss of liberty in general would soon follow the suppression of the liberty of the press, for it is an essential branch of liberty, so perhaps it is the best preservative of the whole. Even a restraint of the press would have a fatal influence. No nation, ancient or modern, has ever lost the liberty of freely speaking, writing, or publishing their sentiments, but forthwith lost their liberty in general and became slaves. Now, this was not a broad call for a completely free press. It's a bit of hyperbole that was basically intended to defend Peter Zenger in the court of public opinion. And that's because these guys expected Cosby to take legal action against Zenger and the paper. In fact, it's important to emphasize that the men behind the New York Journal didn't see themselves as pioneers in expanding the freedom of the press. They're basically waging a local political war on an abusive governor. But, as we always say here at In the Past Lane, history is the study of surprises. Without meaning to, Zenger and his friends would soon play a key role in pushing America to a new and much broader definition of press freedom. Well, Zenger's paper kept up a steady criticism of Governor Cosby. And some of this was done through serious prose, but a lot of it took the form of satire and ridicule. The combined effect was to portray the governor as both a fool and a tyrant. As you can only guess, Cosby did not wait long to try to shut down Zenger's newspaper. In January 1734, just 2 months after it started publication, the Chief Justice of the Colony's Supreme Court, a loyal Cosby man, asked a grand jury to indict Zenger for seditious libel. Seditious libel, remember, was any statement that was critical of the government. But the grand jury declined this request, a sign of just how unpopular the new governor had become. Cosby tried again in October 1734, but the grand jury again declined, noting that there was insufficient evidence. Well, at this point, Governor Cosby is just enraged, so he demands that the Colonial Council do 2 things. First, it orders a public burning of copies of the New York Journal. And second, it orders the sheriff to arrest Peter Zenger for, quote, printing and publishing seditious libels, as having in them many things tending to raise factions and tumults among the people of this province, inflaming their minds with contempt of His Majesty's government and greatly disturbing the peace thereof. In other words, Zenger's paper had divided the public, undermined government authority, and therefore threatened public order. So Zenger was arrested on November 17, 1734, and thrown in jail. The law required that a bail be set that was within the means of the accused. But this judge set the bail at £400, 10 times Zenger's personal worth. There was no way he could pay it, so he ended up staying in jail for 8 months. Men like Morris and Alexander, the guys who were backing his newspaper, they could have posted his bail, but they recognized the public relations value of having Zenger remain in jail. Plus, they made sure his family had sufficient income. Despite Zenger's arrest, his New York Weekly Journal missed only 1 issue, the week of his arrest. And then it resumed publication for good. Zenger's wife Anna played a key role in keeping the paper running. She and her sons took over the press, and they communicated with Zenger in his jail cell on a regular basis. So now let's move to the trial. James Alexander and William Smith were excellent lawyers, and they took up Zenger's case. Not surprisingly, Governor Cosby arranged for the trial to take place before the pro-Cosby justices of the Supreme Court. On April 15, 1735, Alexander and Smith opened the proceedings by arguing that the justices were biased, and therefore they shouldn't hear the case. Well, instead of recusing themselves, the justices disbarred Alexander and Smith. Well, this high-handed action only served to convince still more New Yorkers that Cosby was a tyrant willing to trash the liberties of anyone who opposed him. In place of Alexander and Smith, the disbarred attorneys, the court appointed for Zenger a lawyer named John Chambers. Since Chambers was a Cosby appointee, the situation did not look good for Zenger. But, to the surprise of many, Chambers acted with a great deal of independence. When the court clerk, another Cosby appointee, submitted a list of potential jurors that included mostly pro-Cosby men, Chambers refused to accept it. And eventually, the jury was drawn from all eligible men in the colony. This proved to be a critical success for the Zenger case. The trial finally started on August 4, 1735. To most observers, the outcome just seemed obvious. And here we need to take a moment to look briefly at the key point in British cases of seditious libel. The jury's role was strictly limited to deciding if the defendant published the materials in question, not if that material was true, false, or libelous. If the evidence proved the defendant published the material, they had to find him guilty. Then the judges would decide if the published material in question was libelous or not. In other words, the jury was limited to deciding the facts of the case. The judge would then rule on the matter of the law. So in the case of Peter Zenger, all the prosecution had to do was to prove that Zenger printed the material. And since his name appeared in every issue of the New York Journal as the printer, this would not be very hard. Then the pro-Cosby justices would declare the material libelous, and off to prison Zenger would go. And presumably, that would be the end of the New York Journal.
You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
Okay, back to the trial. The prosecution, headed by the colony's attorney general, began by reading a series of offensive passages from Zenger's newspaper. He then told the jury, quote, "Libeling has always been discouraged as a thing that tends to create differences among men, ill blood among the people, and oftentimes great bloodshed between the party libeling and the party libeled." And he reminded the jury of its very limited task, deciding only if Zenger published the material in question. Now it came time for the defense. John Chambers rose and gave a brief address about libel. He argued that there was no proof that anyone had been libeled. And then he sat down. And at this point came a carefully orchestrated, dramatic moment. An elderly man arose, and he said he wished to join Zenger's defense team. He was Andrew Hamilton, a famous lawyer from Philadelphia, perhaps the most famous lawyer in all the colonies. He'd been secretly invited by Zenger's disbarred attorneys and provided with all their legal preparation for the case. Now, the Chief Justice at this point was so totally flummoxed by the sudden appearance of Hamilton that he surprised everyone by allowing Hamilton to join the defense. And what followed was an extraordinary exhibition of legal theater. The prosecutor stood to call his first witness, who would testify that Zenger was indeed the publisher. But then, Hamilton interrupted and said, "I'll save Mr. Attorney the trouble of examining his witnesses to that point. And I do, for my client, confess that he both printed and published the two newspapers set forth in the information, that is, the evidence, and I hope in so doing, he has committed no crime." Now this was a stunning admission, because it basically looks like he's conceding the whole case. So the Attorney General dismissed his witness and asked the judge to send the case to the jury. And just in case, he told the jury that they must find Zenger guilty, because he just admitted that he printed the offensive materials. But again, Hamilton interjected. The jury, he said, cannot find Zenger guilty. The mere publishing of objectionable words is not libel. Quote, "The words themselves must be libelous, that is, false, scandalous, and seditious, or else we are not guilty," unquote. And here, Hamilton was holding the Attorney General to his own words. For Zenger's indictment had charged that he had published, quote, "a certain false, malicious, and seditious, scandalous libel." Now, it's important to note that Hamilton does not have English law on his side, because, as I noted earlier, there was a long tradition in English law of treating speech that was critical of the government as libel, even if it was true. So the Attorney General knows he has the law on his side, and the justices of the Supreme Court know that the law is on the side of the prosecution and their patron, Governor Cosby. But Hamilton had made a calculated decision. He was going to appeal to the jury. He was determined to convince the jury that they had the right to render a general verdict, not simply on the facts of whether or not Zenger had published the material, but whether it constituted libel. In the law, this is called jury nullification. It's when a jury rejects the prosecution's case because they find the whole proceeding unfair and unjust. Well, what had started out as a slam dunk for the prosecution now turned into a real courtroom battle. Back and forth it went as both prosecutor and defending attorney argued their positions. Hamilton gradually focused increasingly on the question of truth. He asked the court to allow him to prove that nothing Zenger published was false and that therefore none of it could be libel. But the court refused. Hamilton then charged that this was suppression of evidence. He then turned to the jury and said, evidence that is suppressed should be considered evidence. The Attorney General, however, kept arguing that the case was over. Zenger had admitted to printing the newspapers. Case closed. Out of options, Hamilton stood to offer his famous closing statement. The question before the court and you gentlemen of the jury is not of small nor private concern. It is not the cause of a poor printer, nor of New York alone, which you are now trying. No, It may, in its consequence, affect every freeman that lives under a British government on the main of America. It is the best cause. It is the cause of liberty. And I make no doubt but your upright conduct this day will not only entitle you to the love and esteem of your fellow citizens, but every man who prefers freedom to a life of slavery will bless and honor you as men who have baffled the attempt of tyranny, and by an impartial and uncorrupt verdict have laid a noble foundation for securing to ourselves, our posterity, and our neighbors that to which nature and the laws of our country have given us a right, the liberty, both of exposing and opposing arbitrary power by writing and speaking the truth. The jury then retired. They came back only 10 minutes later, which the prosecution assumed was a good sign. But the verdict was not guilty. The courtroom exploded in cheers and celebration. That night, Zenger's supporters celebrated, and the next day, Peter Zenger was released from jail. So, what's the rest of the story? Well, Governor Cosby died in 1736, probably to the joy of his detractors. Andrew Hamilton died in 1741. Alexander and Smith, Zenger's original lawyers, they were both reinstated to the bar. Zenger, well, he went back to printing, and he managed to keep his New York Journal alive for many years. He eventually scored a very lucrative contract as New York's official printer, and the next year he won a similar contract for New Jersey. Peter Zenger died in 1746 at the age of 49. His wife kept the journal going until 1751, but eventually it folded, a rather sad end for such a significant newspaper. But of course, there's more to this story. In a word, Zenger's case played a crucial role in developing what eventually became widely cherished principles of freedom of the press and freedom of speech. The case did not establish any new law or any new legal precedent, but it did popularize three powerful ideas. 1. That freedom of the press was essential to the protection of liberty. 2. That statements that are true cannot be libelous. And 3. That a jury should decide both the facts and the law in libel trials. In making these points, Andrew Hamilton did not argue points of law, but rather political philosophy. And in this, we can see a vivid example of how the American colonies in the 18th century were evolving into their own distinct version of a British society. That is, while they thought of themselves as British, they were developing many uniquely American values, practices, and expectations that would set them apart from their contemporaries in England. In fact, Hamilton made this a central point in his argument. British conceptions of libel, he said, were not applicable in the American context. Prosecutions for seditious libel might be needed in England to protect the king from criticism that could undermine his authority, but seditious libel prosecutions in the colonies threatened liberty, because colonial officials were so far from the oversight of king and parliament. Americans needed to be able to criticize their government to protect themselves from oppressive and corrupt officials. So, how are these ideas popularized? Well, first, James Alexander ghostwrote, under Zenger's name, a short book entitled A Brief Narrative of the Case and Trial of John Peter Zenger. It was published in 1736, and it went on to become one of the most widely read publications in the colonies before the Revolution. The narrative generated a lot of published commentary, both in Britain and in the colonies. And in the colonies, much of this commentary supported and spread the idea of freedom of the press. And we can see this in the fact that after the Zenger trial, colonial governors were very reluctant to pursue seditious libel prosecutions. They knew that it was nearly impossible to get an American jury to convict in these cases. This helps explain why colonial editors, especially in the heated atmosphere of the 1760s and 1770s, operated largely with a free hand as they denounced British colonial officials, Parliament, and eventually the king in blistering terms. So even though the law regarding seditious libel remained unchanged, the political culture of the colonies had changed considerably, thanks to the case of Peter Zenger. Gouverneur Morris, one of the key founding fathers and architects of the Constitution, later reflected that, quote, "The trial of Zenger in 1735 was the germ of American freedom, the morning star of that liberty which subsequently revolutionized America." In fact, the Zenger trial influenced the writing of the Constitution, because one of the lessons drawn from the trial was the need for an independent judiciary and for separation of the powers between the branches of government. The Zenger trial also played a key role in the debates over the Bill of Rights. It left a lasting impression on Americans regarding the need for trial by jury and the right to legal counsel. The biggest lesson, of course, was freedom of the press. The First Amendment declares, "Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press." Now, let's be clear. The full meaning of these words was not apparent in 1791, and it would take decades for Americans to develop our modern notion of exactly what freedom of the press actually meant. In fact, only 8 years after the ratification of the Bill of Rights, Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Sedition Act of 1798 gave the government sweeping powers to prosecute newspaper editors for publishing words that were critical of the government. But, as a measure of the lasting influence of Peter Zenger, the government actually used the law only a few dozen times and managed to only get 10 convictions. And then in 1801, only a little more than 2 years after it was passed, Congress let the Sedition Act expire. Not surprisingly, throughout the debate over the sedition law, critics of the law frequently cited the Zenger case. Here's how legal scholar and historian Paul Finkelman described the larger significance of the Zenger case. What is most important about the Zenger legacy is not that it brought an immediate and total change in the law of libel. It did not. But rather that in the Revolutionary and early national period, it was always there as a beacon for those who were gradually developing an ideology of freedom of expression. Challenges to freedom of the press would, of course, arise in nearly every succeeding generation. But overall, the trend in the 19th and 20th century was toward an ever-broadening understanding of the idea. And this idea, that a free and unfettered press is essential to a healthy democracy, has spread internationally. Of course, there have been mixed results on this score, but it's an established ideal that proponents of democracy around the world continue to fight for. And that's what makes the current trend among some Americans to denigrate the news media so distressing. One even hears open talk, in the highest circles of power in this country, of rewriting libel laws to protect politicians from criticism. These trends threaten a key foundation of our democracy. It's actually quite simple. If you look at all the countries in the world today, the measure of freedom enjoyed by each nation's citizens is directly proportional to how much freedom is accorded the media. The least democratic nations allow the least amount of press freedom. The most democratic nations allow the greatest measure of press freedom. That's the legacy of the Zenger trial of almost 300 years ago. What we do with it is up to us. Let's turn to Thomas Jefferson to give us the final word. Jefferson wrote the following memorable defense of a free press in 1787. Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. If you'd like to learn more about the trial of Peter Zenger, you'll find suggested readings and links to resources at the show page for this episode at inthepastlane.com. You might also want to check out some previous episodes that touch upon the history of the news media in American history. Like episode 11, which includes a segment on the muckraker Upton Sinclair and his expose of the meatpacking industry. Or episode 18, which explores the rise of conservative media in the United States. Or episode 30, which looks at the history of spin and how American presidents have tried, some more successfully than others, to use the media to their advantage. Well, people, as always, this has been a lot of fun. I want to thank you for listening, and I encourage you to weigh in with comments, questions, and suggestions via social media and at our website, inthepastlane.com. At this site, you'll also find a show page for this episode that includes links, essays, images, and further reading suggestions related to all the things we've talked about in this episode. In the Past Lane has been made possible by the hard work and dedication of many people. They include podcasting consultant Daryl Darnell of Pro Podcast Solutions, graphic designer Maggie Salucci, legal services by Tippa Canoe and Tyler Tu, and of course, 1,000 thank yous to our executive producer, Lulu Spencer. Special thanks also to Jay Graham for creating the intro music for this podcast, and to the Free Music Archive for providing the rest of the music for this episode. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world. So let's pay attention to it. Thank you for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another journey in the Past Lane. Hey Lulu, what's your go-to source of news?
Undertaker's Digest.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International. Bye.